Hello, in this video I'm going to take you through some of the basics of correlation, and I'm using examples from education. So here we have the Statlab data, and you can have a look at this on Blackboard and play along yourself. And we've got all sorts of information collected about a child when they were born and then a follow-up test. So we have simple information like here, the sex of the child, whether they're right-handed, left-handed, what day they were born on, what month they were born. And then we've got things like how educated the parents are, both mother and father, what jobs they had, both when the child was born and when the child's been tested, how much money the family makes, both when the child was born and then when the child's been tested. Does the family go to church? All sorts of different variables. And what we're interested in education is thinking about what we can measure that tells us something meaningful about something else that we're interested in. So, for example, measuring every child to assess them for dyslexia is pretty much impossible. We just couldn't test every child. So we need simpler measures to see which children are more likely to have it, and then we test them first. And you can think of any application. Ofsted might decide that they want to inspect schools which are underperforming first. So they look at different measures and they try to predict which schools are doing badly or would need an inspection the soonest. So when you're looking at correlation, I want you to keep that in mind. What's the easy or reliable thing to measure that we think will tell us something useful about the thing we really want to know? So we might want to know who's going to do really well at a degree, but the measure we tend to use is A-level grades, and as you see from the reading, that's not a particularly reliable score, but it's one that everyone still uses because it's really easy. It's a grade you've got anyway, and it's got some sort of reliability. It will very quickly let you take a shortlist of 1,000 down to 500, and you can be fairly confident that you're not getting rid of anyone brilliant. Yeah, you will, but the percentage chances are much lower. So let's have a look at the actual data. So if you open this in SPSS, it will open on either one or two screens. Here you've got the data, so you can see all the raw scores for nearly 1,300 children. And if you click on variable view, bottom left, you can actually see what the different variables are. So, for example, we know that child's birth length is probably going to have some relationship to child's birth weight. So let's just have a look at that. If I plot it on a scatter, so let's put how long the child, I would say tall, but when they're born they're not really stood up, so we're going to talk about length. And here's your graph, and you can see there's a fairly clear there positive relationship. The more you weigh, the longer you are, the longer you are, the more you weigh. Now, that's nice to say. We kind of want to know how strong that relationship is. So we can do what's called Pearson correlation. And this score here is what we're interested in. So in this case, it's 0.780. So basically anything above 0.3 is worth having a good look at and thinking about. Anything above 0.5 is quite convincing. Anything above 0.7 is really strong. And if you have these asterisks, that's telling you if it's statistically significant. So for example, you might get a strong correlation with only 10 students. So SPSS kind of knows that you don't want to put too much confidence in that judgment. So it'll tell you if it's statistically significant or not. Here we've got so many students that statistical significance is probably going to be quite easy to find. So we're interested in the strength, and here we see a very strong relationship that as length goes up, so does weight, and vice versa. We don't know what causes the other, and in fact it's just how long the child's been inside its mother, how well nourished it is. There's some other variable underneath them. It's not that length is necessarily causing weight or weight is causing length. Now, both of those are quite easy to measure, and both of those don't really tell us anything particularly interesting. So let's look at what we'd be interested in from an educational point of view. So let's have a look here. This is a vocabulary test, and we've got another test here, which is basically an IQ test. Raven matrices are those things where you're given, say, 3 shapes and you have to say what the 4th one should be. So let's just have a look at those, and you can see again we've got quite a strong statistically significant relationship, 0.5. So the better you score on the vocabulary test, the better you score on the IQ test. So that's interesting as well. Is IQ predicting that a child's just generally quite good, and if you're good at one sort of test you'll probably be quite good at another? Is there some sort of underlying general intelligence that both of these are measuring in different ways? Or is it the case that if you have a better vocabulary you're more likely to understand the exam questions? Are both of these to do with how well supported the child is at home, or how familiar they are taking tests? So we've got a lot of different ways to think about that data. We can have a little look at that on a scatter as well. So it's useful to see it plotted if you're not quite sure. So again, you can see there's a lot of variety, but you've got this cluster of dark dots here that as one goes up, the other is very clearly going up as well. But again, knowing a test score based on another test score, it's useful to some extent, but what we really want to do, for example a teacher might want to do, is know which students are likely to fail the test before they take it, and then we can decide if we're going to put an intervention in, if we're going to enter them for a different test anyway. So for example, if you're predicting GCSE scores and you need to decide between foundation and higher tier, you're trying to get as much information as you can. So let's have a look at some different predictors, and we'll just stick with vocabulary. So let's look at something like, was the mother smoking when she gave birth? And let's have a look at the mother's age. So we might assume, for example, that maybe older mothers are more responsible, or younger mothers have an easier pregnancy. We know above a certain age there's a higher risk of birth defects. So do those kind of things come into play in a vocabulary test? And you can see here that there's not much coming out of those comparisons. If we read across from the vocabulary score, we can see there's a very weak relationship between the mother's smoking history, and it's not statistically significant. So contrary to what we might think about it doesn't tell us about their general development, but a mother smoking throughout a pregnancy doesn't tell you anything about that child's vocabulary 10 years later. We do have a fairly weak but statistically significant relationship with mother's age, and it's a positive number, which means that the older the mother was when she gave birth, generally the child's going to do a little bit better on their vocabulary test. So let's just have a look at this graph. We'll put mother age at birth going up, and you can see it's not quite as strong a relationship, but you can see there's a general trend in the by the darkness of the circles piling on top of each other. You can see there's a sort of pattern there, but really it's weak. You're not going to convince anybody in a research article. It might be one measure that you look at amongst others. You're trying to build up maybe a more complex understanding. So it's something that we might use. Let's have a look at some other things. So what the mother's doing physically at birth doesn't seem to But let's have a look at what sort of level of education the mother has, and let's have a look at the father's education. Now, the reason I'm not using occupation, if you look at appendix, you can see occupation isn't really ranked. It goes housewife, office, clerical, sales, teach, and then you've got factory worker at 7. So really you would expect professional managerial to be getting a higher number. You'd have to do some resorting here. But we've got another measure which is a lot easier. We've got income. We've got the income when the child was born and the income at the test. So we can look at those. So we're looking at 4 different things. Again, all about vocabulary test. And you can just see by the number of asterisks that we're getting to things that are statistically significant. And you can see by these numbers, 0.357, 0.372, that one not so much, but they're starting to have some strength, some meaning behind them. So we predict that the mother's test education is a fairly strong prediction of how the child will do in their vocabulary test. So the mothers I'll show you the ratings. So it was whether they left school before their final years, whether they left GCSE year, whether they finished high school, whether they went to university, college, it's American, or whether they actually finished university. And the higher education level, the higher score you get, so we can use it in this way. So the higher the education of the mother, then the higher the child's vocabulary score. And we see that the same is true for the father. And actually, it's a little bit of a stronger relationship there. So perhaps the father has a bit more influence. We can also see that if a family is better off when the child's born, that those children will do slightly better at vocabulary. And that's slightly stronger for how well off they are when the child's actually taken the test. So we're getting the idea now that if you have a higher family income, then the children will do better at tests. And again, we need to think, well, what does that tell us? Does it tell us that these parents are cleverer, or are they buying tuition? Do they have more time to spend with their children? What is it that they're doing that's different? If it's something that they're doing which is just kind of a byproduct of them having more money, then maybe that's something that everyone could do. So for example, wealthier families might spend awful class stereotype, but they might spend more time reading to their child, or they might discuss things at the dinner table, for example, and that's a habit that you can do regardless of your income, unless you're working night shifts or something. So we're getting some ideas of what could be useful information. If we just look at some of the other relationships, you can see, for example, that a father's education level and mother's education level are correlated. So they're hooking up at university, or they're dropping out of high school together. So you're seeing there's a very strong relationship there, which is probably what you'd expect. And we're seeing some relationship, for example, between the income and much more, not much, the mother's education level than the father's. And again, that's still true when the child's grown up and we're doing these tests, we're collecting this data. So we're seeing that the mother's education has more of an impact on the family income than the father's education does. And that's interesting as well. So what do we know about the child's vocabulary? Well, we know that the vocabulary can be predicted very well by how they perform in an IQ test. We know that some physical attributes are quite poor predictors. We know that the education level of the parents is quite a good predictor, and we know that family income is. So what we might be wondering here is there something underneath these? Are we measuring education and income, or are we actually getting some sort of idea of social class or some sort of advantage? And it's much so, for example, if we put in something like the height and weight of the child at the time they're taking the test, then you can see that height has some relationship, weight basically not, no. So that's maybe just an age factor because these are young children. So if you're a few months older, you're probably doing a little bit higher on these tests because you're just a couple of months more developed. So what we're seeing is that everything social is having a much greater impact than anything physical. And what I want you to do is have a look at the survey we'll be dealing with in class. This is a much more recent one. This is from children born in 2000. And this questionnaire went out to teachers of children who'd been picked for analysis. And it's, instead of giving the child a test, it's asking for the teacher's assessment of, are they well above average, below average, or well below average on things like speaking, listening, reading, writing, PE, art, design, music, drama. And then we've got different behaviour things. So have they got a good friend? Do they bully? Are they considerate of feelings? Are they restless? Do they lie, cheat? We've got assessments of different situations, for example, the level of difficulty, have they been excluded? What support do they get at school? Do they have SEN statements? Do they have specific special educational needs? How interested do the parents appear to be? So you're not going to know the parents' income from this, but you're going to know something about how involved they are in their child, or at least how involved the teacher thinks that parents are. Does the school do ability groups? Is the teacher male or female? How long has the teacher taught? How long have they taught at that school? Did they do a PGCE or did they do undergrad teaching? All these different things which might help us to know which children are at risk of certain things or need support in certain ways, or which teachers are the best. So you need to have a look at that and decide which questions you find interesting, which ones you'd kind of want to know the answer to, and which ones you think might predict others. And since we finished on qualities of the teacher, let's just have a little look actually. I'll show you church names as well. Do girls do better than boys? Boys do better than girls? One was a girl, two was a boy, so you can see that the boys in this case are having slightly higher vocabularies, and the families who go to church are as well. So we've got some interesting things to talk about there as well. So have a little look, have a play around in SPSS, and most importantly before the class I want you to have a look at the survey that's on Blackboard and think about which questions you find interesting, what things you'd want to measure, what relationships you'd like to look for. Thank you.